May 8, 1945. The war in Europe ends. Across America, church bells ring, crowds flood the streets, soldiers embrace loved ones they haven't seen in years. But in the farmlands of Texas, the cotton fields of Georgia, the lumber camps of Wisconsin, thousands of men in different uniforms hear the news with dread. German prisoners of war. For them, victory means one thing: going home. Yet many will fight desperately to avoid it. The United States held over 370,000 German POWs on American soil during World War II. Most Americans never knew they were there. They arrived by the thousands, captured in North Africa, Sicily, France. Young men who weeks earlier had been firing at American soldiers now found themselves on trains crossing the heartland, staring out at a country untouched by bombs. No craters in the roads. No burned-out buildings. No starving children begging for scraps. Just endless fields of wheat, small towns with white churches, families waving from platforms as the trains passed. It looked like something from a dream. The camps went up fast. Converted fairgrounds, abandoned CCC facilities, corners of military bases surrounded by fences and watchtowers. From New York to California, over 500 camps dotted the landscape. Camp Concordia in Kansas. Camp Hearn in Texas. Camp Ruston in Louisiana. Names that meant nothing to most Americans, but everything to the men held there. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment. America followed the rules, sometimes generously. 3 meals a day, medical care, recreation, even payment for work. 80 cents per day. The prisoners couldn't believe it. Many had expected torture, starvation, the same brutality they'd heard about in Soviet camps. Instead, they got baseball fields. They got movie nights showing American films. They got libraries with thousands of books. They got more food than many American civilians surviving on ration books. Meat twice a day sometimes. Fresh bread. Real coffee. The irony was staggering. These were enemy soldiers eating better than the people who'd captured them. The American guards noticed the prisoners' shock. One sergeant at Camp Alva in Oklahoma watched a group of newly arrived Germans stare at their first meal. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie. One prisoner wept. Another asked if this was a special occasion. The sergeant shook his head. This was Thursday. The farms needed them desperately. With millions of American men overseas, labor shortages threatened to destroy entire harvests. Sugar beets rotting in Colorado fields. Cotton unpicked in Mississippi. Timber operations in Oregon grinding to a halt. Canneries in California shutting down lines. The government made a deal with farmers. German POWs could work outside the camps under supervision. The prisoners jumped at the chance. Anything to escape the boredom, the endless waiting, the suffocating company of men who reminded them of a war they wanted to forget. The first work details went out tentatively. Farmers watched these enemy soldiers with suspicion, rifles nearby, unsure what to expect. Would they sabotage equipment? Would they try to escape? Would they attack civilians? The Germans showed up early. They worked hard, backs bent over crops, hands moving with practiced efficiency. They didn't complain about the heat, the long hours, the back-breaking labor that left muscles screaming. They sang folk songs while they worked. They thanked farmers for water breaks. They asked permission before doing anything beyond their assigned tasks. Farm families began to notice something unexpected. These weren't the monsters from propaganda posters. They weren't the jackbooted thugs from newsreels. They were boys, mostly. Scared, homesick boys who laughed at jokes, played with children, fixed broken machinery without being asked. Boys who showed photographs of their own families back home. Mothers, sisters, sweethearts. Faces that looked like any American family. In small towns across America, something strange started happening. Hatred softened. A farmer's wife in Nebraska began packing extra sandwiches, wrapping them carefully and handing them to prisoners with a shy smile. A camp commander in Arkansas looked the other way when locals invited prisoners to Sunday dinner. Children in Kansas learned German phrases, teaching English words in return, both sides laughing at mispronunciations. The barriers erected by war began to crack. Not everywhere, and not all at once. Some communities remained hostile, refused to acknowledge the prisoners as anything but enemies. But in countless small interactions, humanity broke through. The prisoners absorbed everything. The abundance, first of all. Stores full of goods, shelves stacked high with products in colorful packages. Restaurants serving steaks the size of dinner plates. Homes with electricity and indoor plumbing, radios in every living room, cars in driveways. Things that seemed like distant memories in bombed-out Germany. Things that had never existed for many of them. But more than material wealth, the attitude. Americans argued with their bosses without fear of arrest. They criticized their government openly in newspapers. They laughed at authority, made jokes about politicians, questioned policies without consequence. No one disappeared in the night. No secret police knocked on doors. No one whispered in fear of being overheard. The freedom was intoxicating. For men who'd grown up under totalitarian control, who'd learned to watch every word, this openness felt revolutionary. Letters from home told a different story. Cities reduced to rubble, entire neighborhoods erased. Families starving in the ruins, burning furniture for warmth. The Soviet army advancing from the east, leaving terror in its wake. Women raped, men executed, property seized. The Gestapo gone, but new horrors replacing old ones. Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed not just military targets but homes, schools, hospitals. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. Names that once meant culture and prosperity now meant ash and death. Every letter made the decision harder. Stay in this American camp with 3 meals and a warm bed, or return to a destroyed homeland with no guarantee of survival. The moral weight was crushing. Families needed them, called out for them across the ocean. But what good was returning to a place where they'd only add another mouth to starve? By late 1944, the nature of the prisoners changed. The captured Afrika Korps veterans, the professional soldiers who'd fought under Rommel, they maintained discipline and dignity. They'd been warriors, defeated honorably, and they carried themselves with pride. But new arrivals from France came broken and defeated. Teenagers conscripted in the final desperate months. Old men pulled from retirement. Many had been drafted against their will, forced into uniforms and handed rifles. Some had watched the Nazi regime collapse into desperate madness, officers executing soldiers for cowardice, children sent to die in hopeless battles. They'd seen the concentration camps' liberation in newspapers, photographs that made them sick with shame. Images they couldn't unsee, atrocities committed in their nation's name. The Hitler youth fanatics caused problems in camps, attacking those who questioned the Führer. True believers who refused to accept defeat. They started fights, intimidated moderates, clung to Nazi ideology even as evidence of its evil mounted. But even their fervor faded when months turned into years and no rescue came. No secret weapons. No miraculous reversal. No 1,000-year Reich. Just silence from a regime that had crumbled into dust. The work continued through seasons. Germans harvested American crops under summer sun, cut American timber in autumn chill, canned American food in factory heat. Some discovered skills they never knew they had. A former factory worker from Stuttgart became an expert carpenter, crafting furniture that local families treasured. A university student from Heidelberg found he had a gift for animal husbandry, gentle with horses and cattle. A baker's son from Munich started making bread that local restaurants wanted to buy, paying him under the table. An engineer fixed tractors that mechanics had given up on. A teacher tutored farmers' children in mathematics. A musician formed a camp orchestra that played concerts for local communities. They formed relationships that transcended the war. Real friendships with guards who'd fought against them months earlier, men who'd killed their comrades now sharing cigarettes and stories. Romances, though strictly forbidden, bloomed between prisoners and local women. Meetings arranged in secret, letters passed through sympathetic intermediaries. Love that military regulations couldn't prevent. Children brought drawings to the camps, accepting candy from men they didn't see as enemies. Farmers invited trusted prisoners to family celebrations. Church groups welcomed them to services. The lines between captor and captive blurred until they barely existed. Then April 1945 arrived with crushing news. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler dead in a Berlin bunker. The Third Reich finished. The prisoners assumed immediate repatriation. They packed their few belongings, wrote final letters to American friends, prepared for the journey home. But the logistics were staggering. Ships needed for American troops coming home took priority. Millions of GIs waiting in Europe to return to families. The prisoners would have to wait their turn. Weeks, maybe months. Months became a year. During that year, the letters from Germany grew worse. The British and American zones were recovering, slowly. Marshall Plan aid beginning to flow, reconstruction starting, democracy taking root. But the Soviet zone had become a nightmare. Prisoners from Eastern Germany learned their homes now sat behind the Iron Curtain. Communist governments installed, secret police operating, dissent crushed. Families displaced, property seized without compensation, neighbors vanished to Siberian work camps. The famine was worst in the winter of 1945 to 1946. Germans eating grass, tree bark, rats, anything to survive. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition. Old people freezing to death in unheated apartments. The infrastructure destroyed, the economy collapsed, the currency worthless. Black markets flourished while legitimate businesses struggled. Cigarettes became currency, more valuable than money. The democratic Weimar Republic had failed before, birthing the Nazi monster. What would rise from these ashes? Another dictatorship? Another war? The prisoners in America were eating pot roast. They were playing volleyball in camp tournaments. They were earning money, learning trades, making friends. Some had fallen in love, planning futures with American women. They had hope. In Germany, there was only desperation. The contrast became unbearable. The desperation began quietly. A prisoner in Montana accidentally destroyed his identification papers, claiming they'd been lost in a laundry mishap. Another in Florida gave camp authorities a false hometown, claiming he was from the Western zones when his family lived in Soviet-occupied territory. Without proper documentation, repatriation would be delayed, maybe indefinitely. Some simply refused orders to prepare for departure. Passive resistance, sitting silently when commanded to pack, ignoring roll calls. The guards didn't know how to handle it. These men weren't trying to escape in the traditional sense. They were trying to stay. The escape attempts weren't to get away. They were to get lost. To disappear into the vast American landscape and never be found. To become American in everything but paperwork. George Gartner became the most famous. A U-boat crewman held in New Mexico, he walked away from a work detail in September 1945. Just stepped into the brush and kept walking. The authorities assumed he'd turn up within days. Hungry, thirsty, begging for help. They searched for a week, then a month, then gave up. He vanished for 40 years. Living under assumed names, working construction in California. Never speaking German in public, never contacting his family, never revealing his past. He married an American woman who knew nothing of his history. He built a life, paid taxes, voted in elections. He became American in every way except legally. He surrendered in 1985, an old man who'd built an American life from nothing. The statute of limitations had long expired. He faced no charges, just curiosity from reporters. His story inspired others who'd done the same to come forward. Dozens revealed themselves, former POWs who'd been hiding in plain sight for decades. Others tried less dramatic approaches. They asked camp commanders about staying legally. Could they apply for immigration through normal channels? Could they work off their POW status somehow? Could they marry American citizens and remain as spouses? The answer was always the same. No. Federal law was absolutely clear. Enemy aliens, once the war ended, must return to their country of origin. No exceptions, no appeals, no special circumstances. The regulations were inflexible, written in wartime and unchanged by peace. But the local communities resisted them fiercely. Farmers petitioned Congress with thousands of signatures. These men had saved their crops, their livelihoods, their farms. They were hard-working, honest, thoroughly integrated into communities. Sending them back to a destroyed Germany made no economic sense. Women who'd fallen in love with prisoners protested to newspapers, telling their stories publicly despite social stigma. Local businesses that had hired POW labor wrote letters to senators, praising their reliability and skill. Church groups argued for compassion, for recognition of individual circumstances over blanket policies. They invoked Christian charity, American values, basic human decency. Washington didn't budge. The optics were impossible politically. How could America keep enemy soldiers while American veterans struggled to find jobs in a reconversion economy? How could the government show preference to Germans over displaced persons from Allied nations waiting years for visas? Polish refugees, Jewish survivors, resistance fighters who'd aided America. They waited in camps while Germans asked to stay. The politics were too complicated, the precedent too dangerous. One exception would create pressure for thousands more. The repatriation ships began sailing in early 1946. Prisoners boarded reluctantly, some weeping openly, others silent with despair. They'd been promised that cooperation meant better treatment. They'd worked hard, followed rules, caused no trouble, even helped the American war effort. Their reward was a return ticket to hell. The scenes at departure were wrenching. Farmers shaking hands with men who'd worked beside them for 2 years, pressing money into their palms. Women waving tearfully from docks at men they'd secretly planned to marry, promises to write exchanged in whispers. Children asking why their friends had to leave, not understanding the politics. Guards who'd grown close to prisoners struggling to maintain professional distance, some turning away to hide emotions. Gifts exchanged, addresses written down, vows to stay in touch. Everyone knowing they'd probably never see each other again. Some prisoners did everything possible to delay departure. Feigning illness with symptoms doctors couldn't disprove. Starting fights to get isolated in punishment blocks where they couldn't be processed. Claiming paperwork errors, insisting their documents showed the wrong hometown. Filing appeals through military bureaucracy, creating delays that might last months. Camp commanders, sympathetic but bound by orders, pushed the process forward. They had quotas to meet, ships to fill, timelines to follow. Individual hardship couldn't override national policy. By late 1946, most were gone. The camps emptied, barracks standing silent, guard towers unmanned. Equipment auctioned off, buildings repurposed or demolished. Within months, many camps left no trace they'd ever existed. But a few hundred had succeeded. Through various means, legitimate and otherwise, they'd managed to remain. Some had married American citizens just before regulations changed to prevent it, rushed ceremonies in camp chapels. Others had convinced authorities they faced legitimate persecution if returned to Soviet zones, claiming political opposition to communism. A handful had simply disappeared so thoroughly that authorities gave up searching, their files marked closed. A few had medical conditions that prevented travel, extended indefinitely. The ones who stayed transformed their lives completely. They Americanized their names through legal processes or simple adoption. Heinrich became Henry, Wolfgang became Walter, Johann became John. Klaus became Charlie, Dietrich became Dick, Friedrich became Fred. They buried their accents through relentless practice, listening to radio announcers and mimicking pronunciation. They never spoke German, even to each other when they met by chance. They built businesses, raised families, became model citizens. They joined Rotary clubs, coached Little League, served on school boards. Their children grew up American, often never knowing their father's history. Some men never told their families the truth. Wives discovered decades later that their husband had been a German soldier. Children learned at funerals that dad had a whole life before America. The secret stayed buried because revealing them meant deportation. Even with citizenship, Nazi associations could trigger denaturalization. So they stayed silent, carried their pasts alone. The ones who were forced to return found the Germany they feared. Ruins and occupation, every major city partially destroyed. Food shortages that wouldn't ease for years, ration cards controlling every meal. Political chaos as new governments formed, factions arguing about the future. The Soviet zone was worst by far. Police state control, neighbors informing on neighbors, show trials and executions. But even the Western zones were nearly unrecognizable. The proud nation they'd known was gone, replaced by something uncertain. The economic miracle wouldn't come for years. For now, there was only survival. Rebuilding from nothing, one brick at a time. Many wished desperately they'd found a way to remain in America. Letters arrived at former camps, forwarded to the military. Please, is there any way to return? Could they apply now? Would farmers sponsor them? The answer remained no. A few eventually made it back through proper immigration channels in the 1950s. After the occupation ended, after Germany stabilized, after enough time passed, they applied like any other immigrant, waiting years for visas. They returned to towns they'd known as prisoners, now free men. They found the farmers who'd employed them, asking for jobs. They married the women they'd loved from afar for a decade. They built the American lives they dreamed of behind barbed wire. The irony wasn't lost on them. They'd been prisoners in America and wanted to stay. They'd been freed in Germany and wanted to leave. The American camps, meant to hold enemies, had become sanctuaries. The homeland they'd fought for had become a prison. The place they'd been taught to hate had shown them kindness. The people they'd been ordered to kill had treated them as human. Time revealed the full weight of what had happened. The POWs had glimpsed a different world. One where prosperity seemed possible, where democracy functioned, where the future held promise instead of threats. They'd seen ordinary Americans living lives that Germans could barely imagine. Working-class farmers with cars and radios. Small-town families taking vacations. Children assuming they'd attend college. Opportunities that seemed limitless compared to Europe's rigid class structures. And they'd been treated not as monsters but as men. Given dignity, respect, even friendship. For many, it was the first time in years they'd felt human. Not soldiers, not prisoners, not enemies. Just men working alongside other men. The small towns that had hosted camps carried memories for decades. Murals painted by German POWs remained on chapel walls, religious scenes rendered by hands that had held rifles. Furniture crafted in camp workshops sat in local homes, passed down through generations. Stone markers placed by prisoners decorated parks, commemorating their time there. Baseball fields they'd built still hosted games. Trees they'd planted grew tall and shaded playgrounds. In some communities, former POWs returned as tourists in their old age, seeking the places where they'd been strangely happy despite barbed wire. They found friends who remembered them, now elderly themselves. Shared meals with families who'd welcomed them decades earlier, stories flowing over coffee. Visited graves of prisoners who died in America and been buried with military honors, tending headstones marked with German names. The reunions were emotional, bridge between past and present. Former enemies embracing as brothers. Old women meeting men they'd loved as girls. Children of prisoners meeting children of farmers, discovering shared histories. The story cuts against every expectation of war. Enemies became neighbors. Captivity became refuge. The victors showed mercy, and some prisoners found more freedom behind American fences than they'd known in their own country. The German POWs who tried to stay in America weren't traitors. They were men who'd seen a better way to live and couldn't bear to let it go. They were soldiers who'd found peace and didn't want war's chaos again. They were human beings who discovered dignity and refused to surrender it. Their desperation to remain revealed something profound about the American experiment. That democracy and prosperity weren't just propaganda. That freedom meant something real and tangible. That a nation could treat even its enemies with humanity. The prisoners who stayed became living proof that people could change, that identities weren't fixed, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. They built new lives on the ashes of old ones. They proved that redemption was possible. They showed that sometimes the enemy isn't who we're told, and home isn't always where we're born. Sometimes it's where we're treated as human.